There is lots to unpack. Let's get straight to our panel. Joining us from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, Michael Johns is co-founder and national leader of the U.S. Tea Party movement. With us here in Washington, Eleanor Clift is a political columnist with the Daily Beast. Also in the studio, Hilary Shelton is Washington Bureau Director and Senior Vice President for Advocacy and Policy with the civil rights group, the NAACP. And joining us here as well, Bruce Fein is a constitutional lawyer. Welcome to all of you. Bruce, let me start with you. Let me ask you about this news that we just had in the past hour or so, and that is the White House sending this letter to Congress, calling these charges baseless. It was a very sharply worded letter from White House lawyers.
Well, it just means virtually nothing. If the charges were baseless, Mr. Trump himself would be running to testify, and he would permit Mr. Bolton and those of his inner circle to testify as well as to what the meaning was for withholding the aid to Mr. Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. So we have a full slate of the facts. Insofar as there are elements of uncertainty today, at least with regard to that element of impeachable offense, namely soliciting something of value from a foreign country in exchange for Trump's decision to release the aid. The reason why it's not definitive is because Trump himself has remained silent. You may recall in the Nixon impeachment, there was a subpoena for Mr. Nixon and his documents, and he defied it, and the House voted an article of impeachment separately for that reason. They can't have their investigatory power compromised, or the whole impeachment becomes a scarecrow. Think of this kind of analogy. If you permitted a criminal suspect to decide who the prosecutor could call as a witness to prosecute the case, you'd never have a conviction.
Now, in terms of the process, Bruce, and you were involved in the drafting of impeachment articles against Bill Clinton.
Yes.
What could these articles look like against
Well, they haven't drafted them yet, but if you're looking based upon the hearings that were held in the Intelligence Committee, and what was said in the Judiciary Committee about the Mueller report when it was received, I think we're thinking as a maximum something like 3 articles. One will be an article probably that's charging bribery. Namely, Mr. Trump solicited something of value, namely help in defeating Mr. Biden in the 2020 campaign in exchange for an official act, namely releasing the military aid. Secondly, by asking of something of value from a foreign government in the 2020 campaign by opening the investigation, he's violated the Federal Election Campaign Act that absolutely prohibits any foreign support in a political campaign. Thirdly, they are looking at the idea of obstruction of justice stemming from the Mueller report. Mr. Mueller was agnostic on that issue, but that doesn't foreclose the House coming to a more affirmative conclusion. And the last element, they are flirting with the idea, say, that was established in the Nixon precedent, of saying his defiance of the subpoenas, at least with regard to the impeachment inquiry, is itself an impeachable offense. I think that probably is the broadest spectrum that we can expect that comes out next week.
Right. Hilary Shelton, if we look at the Democrat side, for months, Nancy Pelosi, the House Speaker, leader of the Democrats in the House, she's resisted impeachment. But then there was this somewhat explosive statement from her. Let's watch it.
Our democracy is what is at stake. The president leaves us no choice but to act because he is trying to corrupt, once again, the election for his own benefit. The president has engaged in abuse of power, undermining our national security and jeopardizing the integrity of our elections.
That's quite a turnaround there for her. You know, at one time she said, look, we don't want to impeach the president because he's not worth it. But what changed?
I believe the hearings changed things. Thank goodness what she decided to do is wait and hear the evidence, to actually allow the chairs of her committees to actually stage those hearings and hear what was going on, and from that draw the conclusions they did. The information that came out very clearly began to demonstrate that something wrong had been done, some crimes had been committed, and the president was actively involved. I think it showed a high level of fortitude for her to hold off as she did, listen carefully, no rush to judgment, but listen to what had gone on, listen to the hours of testimony and the pages of information that was presented to them. It was a smart move, in my opinion.
Michael Johns, what do you make of what's happened?
I think the idea, the concept of impeaching the president has been an outgrowth of the enormous disappointment the Democrats have had with the outcome of the 2016 election. And I personally have taken questions about impeachment-related issues even before the president's inauguration. We went through a 2-year exhaustive investigation that ultimately essentially concluded no wrongdoing on Russia collusion, and having listened to 6 or 7 purported fact witnesses on the Ukraine issue, the one common denominator in all of it is no demonstrable legal wrongdoing on behalf of the president. And you have to go through a few facts. I mean, number one, the letters of the transcripts were released that clearly show there was no quid pro quo. President Zelensky says there was no quid pro quo. The aid itself was released, it was not withheld. And this purported item of value, which related to an investigation into Hunter Biden's $50,000 a month retainer agreement with Burisma, a Ukrainian energy company that was involved in a criminal investigation, ultimately was not commenced. The real wrongdoing here, like the Russia wrongdoing, does have to do with Democrats. The president was correct to be concerned about Hunter Biden's engagement. He had no experience in Ukraine, no experience whatsoever on energy matters. And I assure you, Burisma did not find his resume on monster.com. They knew who exactly they were retaining when they brought him on board. It's important to understand what precisely did he do for that enormous amount of money. And when you go through the fact witnesses, there are individuals who were not on the call, people that were on the call who said there was no wrongdoing, and generally a consensus that that the president was not engaged in anything that was even brushing up against illegality, much less rising to the threshold of a high crime and misdemeanor necessary for impeachment.
Eleanor,
So it's a political process.
The Republicans are framing this as just another fishing expedition, a continuation of the Mueller investigation.
Well, they don't defend the president's actions. They say he did it, but so what? And I think that's where Nancy Pelosi's hand was forced. And as she has said several times, the president is self-impeaching because he is basically, and people around him have in various ways basically confirmed that he was soliciting the help of a foreign ally to come up with dirt on a potential political rival, and he was withholding critical military aid, which happens to benefit Russia. And I think that's also, this is now a national security issue, because as Speaker Pelosi said in the remarks that you showed on the screen earlier, she said all roads lead to Putin.
Right.
And I think that's very concerning in this country, because I wouldn't say Russia's an enemy, but it's not an ally. And the president and the Republican Party have basically, shifted their stance on this particular issue. And the facts are there. I don't think they're in dispute. And the Republicans are basically left with saying it's really unfair and we should be looking at Joe Biden and his son instead. Joe Biden's not in the White House.
Yeah,
Donald Trump is.
Right. One other point, Eleanor. Impeachment is essentially a political move. It's not something legal in a traditional sense.
Yeah.
This goes to the U.S. Senate, and as our reporter told us earlier on, they're not going to vote to convict the president.
Right.
So is it an exercise in futility?
I wouldn't say it's futile, because this president is continuing to solicit the help of a foreign government to help him in his reelection. His personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, is in Ukraine as we speak. So this is continuing, and the election is in November of 2020. And I think the House of Representatives, it's controlled by the Democrats, but it is the House. This is constitutional machinery, and you have to draw a line. You can't let a president get away with this. And so there is some accountability, even if he is not removed from office. And we have never removed a president through impeachment.
Right.
Richard Nixon resigned because he knew he had lost support. But this president does command unusually, I would say, fanatical support among the people who support him. They're not a majority in this country, but they're not yielding, and the Republicans in the Senate apparently are going to stay with him. They've concluded that their electoral lives will be over if they don't back this president.
Bruce, so it goes to the Senate. Senators listen to the evidence. Do they measure that evidence like a normal jury do, or do they just say at the outset, we're not interested, we're not going to convict the president?
Well, the Senate decides its own rules. Now, we're deducing what rules were applied with regard to Clinton, the most recent one. The Chief Justice presides, and based upon the precedent, the Chief Justice would make initial rulings on what is admissible evidence, what is not admissible evidence. But ultimately, when it comes to a vote, each senator decides for themselves what evidence to credit, what not. The Chief Justice doesn't give a jury instruction, so to speak. Yeah. If you find X, then you must vote to impeach. That does not happen here. And as Eleanor was pointing out, we've had two cases, Andrew Johnson and William Jefferson Clinton. They were impeached and they were acquitted in the Senate. Yeah. I don't think the consensus is, well, that it was totally irresponsible to go to a trial because you don't win. I mean, to say a prosecutor should never take a case to a jury unless the conviction is already guaranteed. The independence of the House on the impeachment process requires that each member use their own conscientious standard to determine whether they should vote for impeachment. It's not a calculation, well, if the Senate is irresponsible, then I'll neglect my duty. That's not how it works.
Okay. Hilary, of course, there's a big political dimension to this.
Absolutely.
There's an election coming up next year in 2020, presidential election. And I'm wondering what kind of impact this is going to have on that election. Axios reported a few days ago that support for impeaching Trump in key battleground states, 2020 states that is very low.
I think what this provides is actually information that hadn't been able to be provided before. Keep in mind what we're creating is a forum in which information could be gathered that the president himself refused to allow to be gathered. That is, as they subpoenaed witnesses, the president said, no, they can't go. As they asked for documentation, the president said, no, we won't send it. So in essence, what we have now is strengthening the hand of the checks and balances by the Congress and the administrative branch of the government to actually get to the bottom of exactly what happened. One of the things I appreciate about how this is moving along is we raised the issue of Hunter Biden a little bit earlier. Hunter Biden is not running for president. Hunter Biden has not utilized the power of the U.S. government as a way of leveraging another country to do an illegal investigation. Hunter Biden just happens to be convenient because he's Joe Biden's son. But it's Joe Biden is running for president, and he is not president now, and as such is not using the powers we've discussed earlier. So this process allows the American people in our most democratic manner to be able to get data and information that we've much needed as those of us that participate in our democracy. So it's important.
I want to get to Michael Johns, but firstly, Hilary, let me ask you this.
Sure.
If those poll numbers keep going in that direction in those key battleground states, are the Democrats still going to push for this?
I think so. Yeah. I think it's important, at this point, it is important they continue to seek out this information. That I think what most are hoping, at the least, is that the American people will understand what's going on so they can make an informed decision about who should be elected as president as we move into the 2020 election cycle.
Okay, Michael Johns, to Hilary's point about the fact that Hunter Biden didn't leverage the power of the United States government for personal benefit.
We don't know the answer to that question. I think that's a legitimate line of inquiry. I think it's something the Justice Department is looking at currently. He was clearly retained because of his relationship with his father, who was then vice president. The company itself was under a criminal investigation. I think there's plenty of reason to question whether he leveraged the U.S. government. And in fact, Joe Biden individually announced that the aid was being released because the prosecutor involved in that matter was being terminated at his request. So there's plenty of questions about that.
But what he did was not illegal, Michael Johns.
We don't know the answer to that. I mean, just like your panelists there are asking to maintain an open mind on what the president did as it relates to the Ukraine aid, the issue of what did Burisma, this corrupt company in Ukraine, purchase for $50,000 a month and likely much more in fees from Hunter Biden is a legitimate question. Finally, as it relates to the process that we've just gone through, I mean, if you go through these fact witnesses, I personally just made some rough notes on it. You had Ambassador Taylor, right? He said he could not identify an impeachable offense. You had George Kent, who acknowledged he never even spoke to the President of the United States, who was there just sort of because of some purported involvement in and expertise in this. Yet Fiona Hill, she clearly said she never heard Trump reference anything regarding military aid to Ukraine. Yet David Hale, he said he was unaware of any nefarious activities, was his quote. Colonel Vindman, who was their lead witness, said he saw no basis for any allegation of bribery. Yet Ambassador Volker, he said there was no quid pro quo, no quid pro quo.
All right.
And that the only real factual observation, one final point, was Tim Morrison from the NSC, who said definitively, I was on the call, there was nothing wrong. So this really is an unbelievably political process. If this was a grand jury, there would be no indictment.
Yeah, Bruce, I'll get to you. I don't know, very quick question. Is that a valid question? What did Hunter Biden get in return for? Or what did Burisma get in return for?
Well, first of all, that was cherry-picking various statements to come to a conclusion that's not correct. And the dozen government employees and the ambassadors that spoke all made a point of saying it's not their decision to say what's impeachable, that's up to the Congress. Is it a valid question to ask about Hunter Biden? The Bidens are not in government. They are not extorting anybody. They are not part of the impeachment process. And we'll see what the rules are for the Senate and whether...
Okay, but you have to ask...
All right, Bruce, go ahead.
For 2 years, all the facts of Biden were there when Trump was inaugurated. Why 2 years elapsed, nothing happens? Only when the 2020 campaign. Suddenly to become interested, nothing's changed except the 2020 campaign. And with regard to the evidence of a shakedown, we have the intimates of Mr. Trump, Mick Mulvaney, acting chief of staff. Well, of course there was quid pro quo. Of course, this is what we do all of the time. Then, of course, because it's a gaffe to tell the truth, he comes back and later makes a statement, well, I misspoke. Well, nobody makes a statement like that, so critical, misspeaking. John Bolton, he described this exchange as a drug deal. I don't want to get involved with that. A drug deal. And these are people who are close to the president. They're not Code Pink. They're not Democrats at all. So to suggest that there isn't any evidence that Mr. Trump was asking for political favor from Ukraine in exchange for releasing the aid is ridiculous. And lastly, Trump released the aid only when the Congress said, you are violating the Impoundment Act, because that was passed because Nixon was withholding aid that had been appropriated. And once he got his hand caught in the cookie jar, he said, okay, now I will release it. It wasn't something that he voluntarily did, knowing that he could have stopped it because there wasn't going to be any repercussions if he continued to hold it.
What about that, Michael? Some of the president's closest aides, political aides, not civil servants, said that, yes, this was a quid pro quo.
Well, I just went through the actual testimony of the individuals who appeared before the House, and the overwhelming consensus there was no. I will say there's a long history of quid pro quos in American foreign aid, and in fact, the President of the United States has an obligation to ensure that foreign governments are cooperating with the Department of Justice on ongoing investigations. If you look at that transcript, he isn't saying, when he says, do us a favor, not do me a favor, do us a favor, he's talking about the country, and he references the country. He's not, the fact that there might have been a political side effect from this does not diminish the fact that what Hunter Biden was up to and is still an issue of under investigation, was very much an issue of concern and continues to be an issue of concern to the United States Department of Justice. So asking the president of Ukraine to at the very least cooperate with the United States government is entirely reasonable, in fact, almost an obligation.
Hilary, another question. The latest jobs report just came out this morning. U.S. companies added 266,000 jobs in November, and the jobless number is now down to a historic 50-year low. In fact, that prompted CNN to say the latest economic numbers make one thing clear: Trump has a path to win a second term this year.
Well, let me say there's a lot of comfort when our economics looks very, very tolerable, very easygoing, like no challenges along those lines. It's good to see. On the other hand, I do believe as people are looking at what Mr. Trump is doing in the name of the United States, I guess we have to figure out whether it's a capital U.S. or a lowercase U.S., but nonetheless, we're raising issues along those lines. I think people are outraged at what this means to the international community. They're outraged as we're thinking about things in terms of the global reality.
Yeah, but Hillary, if people look at this, you know, jobs, impeachment, what's more important to me?
Well, I think they want things to be worked out well. Yeah. Most people are still making the arguments that the success that Mr. Trump is actually experiencing is a success that was put on track long before he got into the White House. And quite frankly, all he's done is not take it off the track. He deserves some credit for that. But let me just say that if it was set in place by someone like a Barack Obama, then many people believe that, well, Barack Obama's party can probably deliver even more success as we move through this economic challenge.
Right. Bruce, the trial that'll take place in the Senate, do you expect this, in this particular case, will it be a lengthy trial? Will it be drawn out with the Senate calling their own witnesses, et cetera? Or do you think it's going to be a quick affair? They're going to dispense with this?
Well, it depends a lot upon the president's decision to participate. If he does, he's entitled to call his own witnesses. He thinks that they all ought to be exculpatory. If he says everybody thought it was perfect, I expect to have his whole cabinet up there, Pompeo, Mr. Bolton, his chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, everyone saying, oh, yes. I doubt that, but if it could be long, because he's entitled as a defendant to call what he believes are favorable witnesses. I think, however, he will continue to stonewall, which indicated in his White House counsel's letter today, because he understands that the facts are against him. You don't try to conceal things if you think the evidence is exculpatory. You run forward. You want to have an open book. So I would not think the trial in the Senate, given the scope of the likely charges, would last more than 10 days, 2 weeks maximum.
Eleanor, sorry, you want to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say the Clinton trial was just 3 days. And then they took several weeks before they rendered their decision. I don't know why it took that long, but that's how that unfolded. So I don't see what the Republicans would have in it for them to bring a bunch of witnesses. Now, can they bring peripheral witnesses? Can they call Joe Biden, Hunter Biden? It seems a little far afield.
That's where the Chief Justice would make the evidentiary ruling whether this was admissible evidence and that was irrelevant.
That's right.
But I think Mr. Trump would have a right to say, I want my witnesses there. After all, he's the one who's the target of the investigation.
But all the witnesses you can imagine, he's prevented from coming forward. I don't know.
That is correct, and you'd have to think that maybe a leopard changes its spots from time to time.
So just to clarify that the Chief Justice, who will preside over the trial,
yes,
would have the power to either admit a witness or not?
If he thought the evidence was irrelevant. Now, the way in which in the past it's worked is that the Chief Justice makes the initial evidentiary ruling, but you could have a majority of the Senate vote to overrule the decision on evidence. Now, that didn't happen. Samuel Chase presided over the impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson. There were a couple of efforts to overrule his rulings, but that's what would be necessary.
And we have to leave it there. Thank you to all of you for being with us. Thanks a lot. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.